My talk will be about digital sovereignty. I know it's a big word, I know everybody talks about it, but I thought, why not do it too? Preparing this talk actually reminded me that doing something analytical is a lot harder than talking about regulation. The last 2 years here, I spoke about the Cyber Resilience Act. Actually, I realized in the same hoodie. So this is now my legendary traditional FOSS backstage hoodie. I will wear it every year. So when we talk about law gives us pretty clear guardrails. You know what is in it, you know what's not in it, and it gives us also a framework for interpretation. Yes, there are things that are unclear, but we can discuss in a certain framework. Here, we will define the framework ourselves. So when we talk about digital sovereignty, I'm using the Center for Digital Sovereignty definition. Thank you, Germany, for setting up something like SENDIS. Quite cool. So digital sovereignty describes the abilities and opportunities of individuals and institutions to be able to perform their roles in the digital world independently, self-determinedly, and securely. Now, it is pretty much a given that people say, and for that we need open source. Yes, we do. But why? So let's ask a little bit, what problem are we trying to solve with this? And I've listed in my opinion, most obvious problems here, kind of in an order from small to large, or smaller problems to massive worries. So we basically, as society, seek resilience against present threats. And the present threats are at a commercial level, proprietary lock-in. The vendors of our systems basically control the roadmap, the pricing, when they end support for the products that we depend on. That's mostly a problem of getting the right thing to solve a problem for me. But we have a bigger problem, and that is foreign corporate control over the systems that we use, including forced access to data that should be hosted in our systems. And these decisions are made in other jurisdictions, and this clearly touches on the topic of sovereignty in the sense of the theory of the state. And then an even bigger problem is that we have diverging state policy goals. Like we have kind of friendly state policy goals, industrial policy, competition, trade, intellectual property. This is where reasonable people can disagree over the goals and we can negotiate and then it will be a trade agreement. But we also have adversarial action. We have Russia's aggression in Ukraine. We have other aggression in the world right now, as you know. So we do want to achieve digital sovereignty to be better able to solve these problems, to have resilience, as many people frame it, as you see in the picture, to maintain our state of sovereignty. And if you dig further into the SENDIS website, you find a breakdown of 3 aspects that this requires. Choice, adaptability, and influence. By the way, I kind of rephrased it a little bit for clarity, but you'll find it on the website. Choice means the option to choose, flexibly switch between the solutions that you think are the best for you. Adaptability means to co-shape these solutions, be able to influence how they work, be able to acquire the skills to operate them, and to collaborate with the developers. And adaptability is more on a technical level, and then influence is, can I influence the technical roadmap of this solution? Can I participate in the governance of it? Can I understand the motives of the people who are contributing to it? And open source very clearly promises to deliver on all 3 of these dimensions. And the question is a little bit, are we digitally sovereign yet? And the answer is maybe. So open source has existed for 30 years, 3 decades. I made my first commits in '97. That is almost 30 years ago, 29 now. And while free and open source software was available all that time, big tech grew mostly outside of Europe. We have not seen pervasive adoption of open source technologies for digital public goods. Surprising. And we just recently learned 265 billion euro per year flow as spending of the European countries to big tech providers who are not sitting in Europe. So from my perspective, this is not a great picture. On the right, you see one statement from a report that we published last year, the World of Open Source Europe Spotlight, that was subtitled Open Source as Europe's Strategic Advantage. And it says that of the respondents to this report, pretty much all of them saw open source as critical to digital sovereignty, providing greater control and agency over European technology stacks. This is freely available on our website, so please have a look. So the conclusion from this is open source technologies enable achieving digital sovereignty, but they don't really do it for you. You have to do something about it. You have to have the capacity to implement those solutions and to operate them. And capacity here means 3 layers: policy, capability, and implementation. And what this all means is we're talking about the capacity to exercise the freedoms that the software licenses give you. And this, I hope that there are some policymakers in the room. This requires consistent action to maintain a state of digital sovereignty. This is what people refer to as resilience, the ability to respond to threats, to respond to changes, to make sure that you kind of take a hit and you rebound and you go back to where you want to be. At the policy level, this requires a principled approach that enforces measurable sovereignty criteria for all digital public infrastructure across the EU. I think very much as a European citizen in this, I think what member states do supports, but really the action needs to be at the EU level. In terms of capability, it means building the expertise required to attain digital sovereignty. And we see a lot of sovereignty washing, sovereign clouds hosted on European soil by foreign companies, or a checkbox, yeah, it's open source, but you can't really contribute to it or modify it. This is not what we're talking about, right? Capability means exercising all these freedoms. And this will require, and this is kind of a takeaway at the beginning of the talk, a reversal of the degradation of public sector efficacy that we see pretty much across Europe. Because we can't ask people to smartly procure digital infrastructure if they're not able to understand what they're buying, or it's a black box. And at the implementation level, we talk a lot about leveling the playing field, improving the business environment. Yes, this is important. If you saw the outcomes from the French-German Digital Summit in November, one of the key themes there was competitiveness, being able for European companies to actually compete at eye level. And we're not really there. So the call to action here very clearly is we need to build digital sovereignty into the EU market at these 3 levels with concrete policy goals. So kind of the agenda for this talk, 10 minutes in, is what is the gap between open source adoption and active participation? What are the strategies that are required to navigate these 2 environments that I will explain, collaboration and competition, and how do we measure digital sovereignty to be able to say, did we actually improve? So we're going to talk a little bit about a framework for this. Let's begin with a very blunt statement. There is no digital sovereignty without free and open source software. The 4 freedoms that are embedded in every open source license directly enable the 3 sovereignty dimensions that I've laid out for earlier. Choice, we have the freedom to use and the freedom to redistribute. This mitigates lock-in and reduces the switching cost. Switching costs are always there. They also include the time you spend to learn how to use a technology. This happens with open source software as well. But at least you have the choice to learn something while you're using another thing and decide, is this better for my purposes? Can I switch? Supporting adaptability is, for example, the freedom to study. Often an oversight in the discussion is, if you want to learn technology, you need to be able to look into it. The freedom to modify is part of that, because contributing to code is the best way to understand how it works. And this kind of enables you to decide your own destiny and to act. And when it comes to influence, of course, the freedom to modify and to redistribute the software and to contribute back to the stack allows you to become a valuable contributor in a meritocracy and to control the trajectory of the software that you're using. And it's important to highlight, commercial software is not bad, proprietary software isn't evil, but it gatekeeps those freedoms that I explained, and you have to negotiate to get them, and often you won't, because you're not able to pay enough. And that's why there is no digital sovereignty without FOSS. And here's the big however. This all sounded amazing. This sounded like every open source contributor would present about it. But I don't think these rights are enough to achieve digital sovereignty. The freedom to fork does not mean that you have the ability to maintain a fork. It requires staff that is able to understand what software you now control and own. The staff that is able to fix a problem that you find in that software, And keep in mind, a fork is already, at the beginning, a rotting snapshot, unless you start maintaining it actively. That's why having your own fork is always a bad idea if there's a bigger community out there. You cut off from patches, you cut off from new feature developments, and you insulate yourself from the community. The right to modify something doesn't mean you have the capacity to contribute. This requires institutional commitment. We often still hear talk like, oh, this company dedicated a maintainer to an open source project. This doesn't mean that it's integrated in your engineering processes. This is where it needs to be. When you change a dependency, you should do this upstream. This should be part of your day-to-day engineering work. It is for companies that embrace this. And the option to switch does not mean you have the expertise to switch. This boils down to almost like a fight between procurement and engineering. Do I buy a black box based on a specification, or do I buy something that I understand how it works? And this requires skills to evaluate the alternatives, to migrate safely, and most importantly, to actually operate the replacements. And the reality that we have today is that we technically want to achieve digital sovereignty in a walled garden. We have the freedoms that we spoke about, but exercising them is painful and costly. And as a result, the organizations and the governments and the public agencies that we look at, they willfully decide to stay in that garden. The gates are open, they could do something else, but it would require action, effort, and investment. And that basically means that the potential security that free and open source software gives you does not automatically translate to actual sovereignty that you can achieve by embracing this. Attaining actual sovereignty with regards to choice, adaptability, and influence requires appropriate strategy for how the software is developed that you're using. And this strategy is fundamentally different when you talk about a collaborative environment and a competitive environment. And this is not new at all. This is something that the industry has adopted since at least 2005, where they separated how do we deal with intellectual property rights, etc., patents, etc. I'd worked in this area, in an area where we want to collaborate versus an area where we want to compete. And policymakers are now slowly waking up to it 21 years later, and the CRA is one of the first indications with its distinction of open source software stewards and manufacturers. So basically, there has been this mantra, differentiate or collaborate in industry for, I would say, since 2005. And this essentially means that for non-differentiating foundational technologies, you want to collaborate with others, you want to share the investment, you want to share the expertise, and collaboration works best the bigger it is, so globally. So basically, sovereignty here in this space means participation, not ownership. Open source licenses give everybody the right to use the software for any purpose. The fact that you own that copyright means little for the adoption of the software. So collaboration wins in this collaborative space because the complexity of the solutions that we're developing exceeds the capacity of any single actor or developer. The network effects that we see mean that the market will converge to one currently dominant solution. And the security that we want to maintain globally requires broad review. And this is the collaborative environment. In contrast to that, we have the competitive environment. Now, there was some talk in the past of like everything in the future will be open source. I don't believe that. There is a benefit to competition. There is value in differentiation. Differentiation means convincing your consumers that they buy your product and not that of your competitors. And that's not what open source does for you. This is what you do in your product design. So there are applications and services where the user needs diverge. There are needs for integration across systems according to the specifications of the customer. There are vertical solutions that integrate a significant open source stack to more value-added customer-facing solution. And here, competition clearly wins. The differentiation drives innovation and investment. Competition remains, not everyone likes to hear this, but it remains the best allocator of price or value for money. You never want to be bound to a single vendor. And local vendors much better understand your requirements. So in the competitive environment, sovereignty means leverage in customer relationships, in contracts, in regulation, and a relationship to vendors that see you at eye level, not as a colony. Yeah, and so basically the rules for these two zones, competitive and collaborative, are different. They're really different. Ownership works differently, it means different things. The agency of an actor in this space depends on how the space operates. In a collaborative zone, open governance wins. There's an expectation to reciprocity in your behavior. You give because you take. Open source licensing is normal, and you gain influence through participation. We call it a meritocracy. In the competitive zone, this is essentially supplier management. You are buying a solution from a supplier, and that means you need to be able to negotiate at eye level. You need to be able to manage these relationships, to have leverage over what you're getting and the price you're paying, and you need to have influence as a customer. And I think you can clearly see how if you try to apply like a governance norm or behavioral norm from the competitive space to the collaborative space, you'll fall flat on your face. This is what we're trying sometimes when we're talking about build your own. I'll get to that. And this is why nurturing regional competition is a sovereignty strategy. There was a press panel recently, and I was quoted with this statement saying, every procurement decision is a vote for the future. I really believe that. If we spend 265 billion per year to big tech providers that are not located in Europe, we are investing into their product development. And please keep in mind here, I'm an economist by training, every euro we spend has a multiplier effect. Right? You spend a euro and the company invests that euro and they will get 2 euros back in value, not us, because that money is not invested in Europe. And the long-term effects of this, they absolutely compound. There is an atrophy of capacity, of understanding, of knowledge transfer. We will have a knowledge drain because innovative and enthusiastic people will go where the companies are that build the products. And your innovation will basically be displaced by the actors that you fund with your own procurement efforts. So, and it's important to keep in mind here that any commercially supported solution comes from the competitive zone. So procurement always basically picks winners. This is the case. Procurement spends a lot of money, especially in the public sector. And the choices that we make there, they shape which innovative ecosystem, which competitive ecosystem thrives globally. And we don't have any leverage if there are no regional providers that we can work with on eye level. The strategic framing that I formulate for that is called interdependent autonomy. This is more for the collaborative space. So interdependent autonomy achieves sovereignty by collaborating openly at on the best technical solutions, leveraging global contributions and capability while maintaining agency over the technical trajectory and supplier relationships through active participation. This is what you should do if you want to navigate a collaborative environment. Participation earns influence. Adoption without contribution doesn't. Make sure that you leverage those 75% of contributions that do not come from your own region. And understand that maintaining and securing digital infrastructure requires global collaboration. We sometimes make mistakes here. We think that if you roll our own, we can be better. This is a paradox, and I think it should become clear now based on the different ecosystems I have described. Interdependent autonomy, what I've just described, wins over isolation. Why? Because it improves choice. If you roll your own, you reduce the choice that you have to the winner that you have picked. Your contributions are reduced to 1/4. That's what one region in the world contributes. In terms of adaptability, you don't have access to best-in-class solutions anymore. And most importantly, I believe you're reducing the competitive pressure on your local suppliers. You never want to do that because they will get lazy and fat. And in terms of influence, the global trajectory of technology will most definitely diverge from what you have picked as a winner, and you will always have to catch up with that. So basically, in the collaborative environment, open collaboration always wins, and you want to get access to those 75% contributions that don't come from Europe. So basically, I've elaborated a lot what we need to do. We know that open source is necessary, but not sufficient. We know that we have these two different zones, collaborative and competitive, and that interdependent autonomy is the framing for collaboration. But I would like to give you a bit more concrete guidance on how to go at this problem, how do we operationalize this. Is there a diagnostic tool that tells us how digitally sovereign we currently are? Is there a tool that can help us allocate limited budgets to the decisions on where to invest? And how can we trace the impact? Here you go. We've taken the definition by Zendis, and we've broken it down to 3 layers on each choice, giving you a 3x3 matrix. And it basically says, for choice, adaptability, and influence, you should go from being dependent to being sovereign. And you can assess that for every single dependency that you have, etc. So how do we apply this? When it comes to choice, keep in mind that contribution is the best knowledge transfer mechanism. So if you enable your teams, your suppliers, etc., to work upstream with open source communities, they will learn how the technology works and they will serve you better. When you're dependent, you depend on the vendor control, on the vendor roadmap, you depend on their pricing. We've all heard in news that our vendors are just magically doubling their prices overnight. This is because we're a price taker. We have zero influence on this, and this is because we're dependent. If you're transitional here, then you may use an open technology, but you're still relying on a single vendor that dominates your market. You cannot switch either. You may look into the technology. And sovereign really means having multiple vendors, having open governance on the projects, and having real competition. When it comes to adaptability, again, upstream contribution builds the expertise that you need to adapt the software solutions. The dependent state is basically the PR and pray mechanism, right? You submit a pull request and you pray that somebody will hear you, but you have zero influence. And your architecture will then adapt to the tool that you are buying. You have no other choice. Transitional means you can customize, but the core is still something you can influence. And sovereign means you understand deeply, you're able to contribute upstream, and you shape the roadmap. And on influence, I'm speeding up here already, thank you. On influence, you basically need to learn how to exercise governance through contributions and leverage. When you are dependent, you have no voice in direction. You learn about decisions in the release notes, it's too late. In a transitional state, you can patch, you can supply patches, but you don't really have influence over will they be adopted and when. And as a sovereign influencer, you are a co-maintainer, your colleagues are board members or working group chairs, or if it's a commercial relationship, you're a key customer that your supplier will actually listen to because your budget is big. And we can use this for a diagnostic exercise. You can basically say, I'll create an inventory of my critical components. This is a very useful exercise for any company. I've been preaching that for 10 years. Know your components. And then you can say, what is my status quo? Define the assessment standards for your organization and place your component in this 3x3 matrix. And make sure that you apply the assessment standards consistently, because then you can compare the results between these different components and initiatives. And then the dynamic test is, you do the same, but you estimate how would my positioning change if I invest into changing my posture with regard to that component. Can I go from transitional to sovereign for this? And if you do that, then you can say you can rank the initiatives or components by their sovereignty impact, and you can basically allocate your budget from the top down until you run out of money. And this will make sure that you get the most bang for the buck for your digital sovereignty investments. So there are 2 strategy recommendations I would make here. One is active engagement. Make upstream contribution a regular part of your engineering practice. And this is the same for a public sector actor and for a private company. And it doesn't matter if your company is not a digital native company. You can do that. Contribute, and ideally you reward people for the contributions that they do. Don't make it a side project. Allocate time to that. So yeah, keep in mind, upstream contributions are the best knowledge transfer mechanism available. Seek governance roles in critical projects. Make sure that these projects have a viable community behind them so that they don't fade away because nobody wants to contribute to them. Second recommendation is capacity building. I think this is really important in a European context. The knowledge transfer that I've been talking about needs to be institutionalized. It needs to be something that is long-term enforced. It's the best way to understand the systems that we depend on. Create a career path that rewards open source work, measure participation, see how many patches you submit, and shift from black box buying to in-house architecture ownership. This is for the public sector procurers. Sovereignty requires technical staff that understands what they're procuring. And this leads me to my conclusion. Does free and open source software buy you digital sovereignty? Yes, some. So first step, yeah, it's necessary but not sufficient. There will be no digital sovereignty without free and open source software, but licenses alone do not give you that. They only give you a potential sovereignty, and you need to actively participate to achieve it. The interdependent autonomy framing is incredibly important for collaboration because it allows you to gain influence in a collaborative zone, and it promotes competitiveness and competition of the regional suppliers that you foster by enabling them to work upstream. And then the third takeaway is digital sovereignty is measurable. It's not something that is a mystery. Look at the definition, look at the criteria, and then promote choice, adaptability, and influence across your ecosystems. Own the architecture and gain influence as an ecosystem steward. 1 minute over, sorry.
Thank you, Mirko. All right, any questions for Mirko?
Hi, so you made a very convincing case that free software is a strong way to reach these criteria for digital sovereignty. But you also mentioned that there are pseudo-solutions, let's say, where foreign tech companies promise that they have a European sovereign whatever. And I think we have seen in the past that these foreign tech companies will go to great lengths to prevent losing their business to open source. So while the roadmap you lay out is very positive, I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about taking how we could avoid taking the wrong turn there and avoiding European governments taking what may be the path of least resistance and simply checking the box in AWS, whatever, that says European sovereign.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I kind of tried to make that case with the presentation. We can't blame tech companies for innovating. Sometimes we do this. They're developing all the new things, and they're investing massively. Like, look at the AI race currently ongoing. The investments there are mind-blowing. So we can't say, oh, please invest a little more so that we're able to catch up. I really think we need to change our own posture, which is more expertise. I think we've hollowed out our public services too much. They're not able to own digital infrastructure anymore. They're depending on suppliers. And these suppliers are all big tech companies. So my case is we need to build expertise and capacity within our own organizations to be more at eye level with the suppliers of the solutions. And when I say own your architecture, I really mean don't just buy black boxes. Own the architecture and buy components to this architecture, retaining the capacity to switch components if that one's not the one you want anymore. Buying global solutions, you've all seen these like procurement contracts for $5.5 billion for a piece of software. Well, my reaction as an open source contributor is I can rewrite half the world of software with $5.5 billion. So this is crazy to me, right? So we need to change this posture. And I really think it's our own homework. It's not telling the others what not to do. It is telling us where we need to invest and to learn.
Hi, I think you made a great point about the digital sovereignty being about ownership and everything, but this sounds very much convincing to anyone who's working in a big organization, big company, anything. But especially in Germany, I'd say we're very much also dependent on like small and really small enterprises who do not have even one developer working for them, and they're very much relying on cloud. Also startups who are trying to upscale quickly, relying on AWS and stuff. What perspectives do you have for those? Because I think that's really big market here, especially in Germany. That's very absolutely not sovereign and very dependent, and I don't think they can go that path, at least alone.
That's a very difficult question, because I do believe that much of this dependency is learned and habitual. Like, why do we go and host everything on the big cloud providers? There are European cloud providers, pretty successful ones, that have their residence in Europe, and they offer you the same open source technologies. Why do you not go there? Is it slightly more inconvenient? Is it not what you learned in school? I think the alternatives are there. Maybe it's not completely trivial, but to say, well, I have no choice, and therefore I have no choice. That's kind of we're going in circles on this. And when we talk about spending 265 billion euros on IT services and products, unfortunately, we're not talking about small and medium-sized companies. This is not a market served by a one-person company. This is more a governance issue of our own competitive environment. This is why I had this in the presentation. I really think we need to improve the starting position, basically, of our European companies as they build local services. But I think the choices are there. It's so much easier to adopt open source technologies today compared to a couple of years ago, that I think the homework is really with the companies and with policy. So.
Okay, thank you, Mirko.